For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susie Paulman, currently serving as president of the Annapolis campus. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight, and most especially two groups. First, our alumni who are here for homecoming. It's been really wonderful to meet some people that I have never met, and to see some people that I haven't seen in a long time. And then our second group, we have our Graduate Institute convening weekend. So our low residency students are coming in to join our in-person Graduate Institute students for this weekend as well. So we'll welcome them. I wish all of us a wonderful weekend of friendship and excellent conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Macfarland.
Thank you. I guess I'd like to offer my own greetings to the alumni and the GI coming for the convening weekend. Thank you for coming to the lecture tonight. I know many of you have been thinking, I want to relive junior laboratory, so I've come to satisfy that desire. I also, the first time I read Galileo's dialogue was in a preceptorial when I was a student with Jim Bell almost 40 years ago. And then a few years ago, Leah Lizelle ran a faculty study group on Galileo. I was not very good about attending, but I learned a lot from that group, and it reignited my interest in the book. So I want to thank everyone I've talked to then and more recently about the book to help me discover the questions that I wanted to ask tonight. Okay. In Sarsi, this is from Galileo's The Assayer. In Sarsi, I seem to discern the firm belief that in philosophy one must support oneself upon the opinions of some celebrated author. Perhaps he thinks that philosophy is a book and something imagined by a man, like the Iliad or Orlando Furioso. Well, Signore Sarsi, that is not how matters stand. Philosophy is written in this very great book that continually stands open to our eyes, I mean the universe. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which the book is composed. It's written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. The lecture tonight will travel back and forth between these two poles, the universe as it stands open to our eyes, and the universe as a book written in the language of mathematics. And the lecture has 4 parts. I'll start with the 20th century philosopher Edmund Husserl, who gives a rich account of Galileo's mathematization of nature. Then I'll look at a couple examples of how Galileo ponders and reflects on the appearances in order to seek the foundations for a new mathematical natural philosophy. Third, I will look at some examples of Galileo's faulty attempts to give mathematical accounts of motion. And finally, I will turn to Galileo's letter to Christina of Lorraine, his preeminent treatment on the freedom of philosophy, in order to offer an explanation of how to unite his reflections on the phenomena with his mathematical enterprise. Galileo's claim about the book of the universe, that it's written in the language of mathematics, appears to have been a sort of rallying cry for any number of philosophers who came after him for the rapid development of mathematical physics in the following generations. Galileo's statement marks a fundamental change in how nature is conceived and known. Husserl refers to this as the mathematization of nature. For the first time, from the manifold intuitions of everyday life was created an objective world, a totality of objects that are determined as the same for everyone. The ideal forms of Euclidean geometry that were originally conceived as estranged from the world are now applied back onto the world. The geometrical idealizations become the general method for knowing the real. The creation of an objective world expressed in mathematics coheres with a profound suspicion of the appearances. This is familiar to juniors from having recently read Descartes' Le Monde. A decade before Descartes, Galileo made a similar claim. In The Assayer, the same book from which this quotation comes, Galileo denies that heat, as we feel it, is a real phenomenon or property that resides in the material. What belongs to the material as such is shape, boundedness, or better, a multitude of shapes that have varying speeds. Consider the experience of being tickled. The motion of a feather across the surface of a body tickles or does not tickle, depending on the part of the body. The titillation of being tickled belongs to the person, not to the instrument, not to the feather. Galileo believes no more solid an existence belongs to many other qualities which we come to have attributed to physical bodies, tastes, odors, or colors, and many more. According to Husserl, this suspicion of the reality of the senses is a fitting consequence of the mathematization of nature. Quote, everything which manifests itself as real through the specific sense qualities must have its mathematical index in events belonging to the sphere of shapes. Galileo inherits a geometry, a pure geometry, ready-made from Euclid and Archimedes. According to Husserl, in inheriting this geometry, Galileo makes a fateful omission. He does not inquire back into the original meaning-giving achievement at the origins of geometry. Galileo accepts the a priori self-evidence of geometrical objects with a sort of naivete, and so guides geometry to the idea of physics, which now arises for the first time. The application of geometry enables one to overcome the relativity of subjective interpretations in the intuited world. He launches the enterprise in which physics, always advancing, loses track of the path to its own origins and its source of meaning. Husserl believes that one inquires back into the meaning-given achievement of geometry by stepping behind the axioms and theorems and considering the pre-theoretical practical activities, smoothing surfaces, taking measurements, surveying land, that were the condition for the spiritual achievement of creating geometry. One returns in thought to the pre-theoretical practical activities to discover the original ground of that spiritual achievement. Science becomes demonstrative, necessary, by formulating axioms from which the theorems are demonstrated. Husserl suggests that the self-evidence of the axioms is not the same as the original self-evidence of the ideal objects. The original historical meaning construction of the idealities stands behind the axioms. Geometry as a deductive science is a logical superstructure. The logical superstructure of geometry is not so great that one could not return to the axioms, and from the axioms proceed back to the original self-evidence. The axioms are a sort of doorway to the consideration of the prior historical origins. One may go past the axioms to consider those origins, but insofar as the axioms serve as a starting point for the necessary demonstrations, they may also block the way to those origins. As mathematical physics progresses, idealities pile on top of new idealities. The logical superstructure becomes ever more vast, and the ideal objects become more distant from the pre-theoretical origins. The life world is dressed up in mathematical objects as a garb of ideas. We take the disguise, the mathematical structures, as the true world. In Husserl's characterization, Galileo exemplifies the movement and progress of physics. He is, quote, at once a discovering and a concealing genius. He discovers the a priori form of the true, idealized, and mathematized world, but at the same time, the intuited world of our daily life is rendered merely subjective. The truths of pre-scientific life are deprived of value. Husserl's singling out of Galileo as the paradigmatic figure in characterizing modern science seems fitting, given his famous assertion that the grand book of the universe is written in the language of mathematics. But my intention this evening is to think about this characterization, about Galileo's fateful omission, about the failure to go back to original pre-theoretical meaning-giving achievement of geometry. So, part 2, Galileo's questioning of appearances. I will turn to Galileo's dialogue concerning the two world systems. Like the two new sciences, familiar to juniors and now seniors, this is a dialogue between three persons, Salviati, Simplicio, and Sagredo. Salviati is the protagonist. He does the most to advance the Copernican view, and within the fiction of the dialogue, he's the character who is friends with the author Galileo and knows Galileo's mathematical work. Salviati's antagonist is Simplicio, an Aristotelian and an adherent to the Ptolemaic system. The third character, Sagredo, is unaligned. He's the most quick-witted of the three, and so most ready to appreciate Salviati's arguments. And for the most part, I will be analyzing Salviati's arguments insofar as he serves as a kind of spokesperson for Galileo, but I'll also note the back and forth between Salviati and Simplicio, which is the reason I wanted to introduce you or reintroduce you to the characters. Of course, the dialogue concerning two world systems, Copernican and Ptolemaic, the dialogue concerning the two world systems, Copernican and Ptolemaic, is perfectly suited to the development of a philosophy that rebels against the appearances in favor of mathematical models. The Ptolemaic system naively coheres with our pre-theoretical experience. Right now, we feel ourselves to be at rest, and if we look up very patiently, we will see the heavens in continual motion. Ptolemy's mathematical constructs are said to save the appearances. The motions of some heavenly bodies appear irregular, but the mathematical constructs exhibit the underlying regularity. Even we, as doctrinaire Copernicans, we have to contest the appearances in order to explain the system to ourselves. We picture the Earth revolving about its axis and traveling around the sun, even though we have no sensation of such motions. In conceiving the system of the sun and planets, the concentric orbits, we view it not from where we sit, but from an imagined point of view outside the system. We noted the doctrine of Galileo and Descartes that denies the reality of sensed qualities, heat, color, tickling, in favor of a system of mathematical shapes in motion. That this counterintuitive doctrine should arise precisely when the Ptolemaic system was being overthrown appears to be no coincidence. The basic stance of the dialogue is that there's nothing in the appearances, nothing in our everyday experience that can determine whether the Earth is at rest or in motion. At first blush, one would say that this stance is implicitly hostile to the appearances. If by all the appearances we're at rest, then to deny such appearances are determinative is to put the appearances into question. Yet I believe Galileo understands this stance as neutral, not as hostile to the appearances, but as being open to them, as being ready to consider them afresh, with a free-ranging imagination so that we can learn from them. Salviati starts by saying it's a mistake to think that what we take to be the naive appearances are actually so. It's a mistake to think that they're free from tacit theoretical suppositions. For example, early in the dialogue, the antagonist, Simplicio, says that although Aristotle had the most perspicacious intellect, for him, sensed experiences were to be preferred to any reasoning of the human mind. For the peripatetic, the question of whether the Earth moves is decided by one simple observation: what happens when a body falls? The senses are sufficient to persuade us that heavy bodies descend towards the center of the universe. Salviati counters that what we observe is that parts of the Earth removed from the earth move towards the earth. Perhaps the parts of the earth that move towards the center of the earth, but whether the center of the earth is the center of the universe is not known. It's not known whether the universe has a center, and it certainly is not known from the appearances. Is the universe finite? If the universe is infinite, then it has no shape and it has no center. The argument for the finitude of the universe arises from a prior assumption that the heavens move circularly around us. From the apparent circular motion of the stars about the earth, it is inferred that the stars form a sphere, and the sphere, as a geometrical object, has a center. If it were the earth that rotates rather than the stars, then the argument for the finitude of the universe loses its ground. Leaving open the question of whether the universe is finite, Salviati speculates at a minimum that the stars vary in their distances from the earth. Some may be, he says, several times the distance of others. Even if the whole is finite, its shape is not known. And by speaking of a body falling toward the center of the universe, we allow simple appearances to be tacitly shaped by theoretical suppositions. Even if it is allowed that the center of the earth is not the center of the universe, Simplicio still argues that the simple experiences of watching a body fall shows that the earth does not move. Okay, this is my first ever PowerPoint, but I decided to go old school and do it with chalk. So I hope the alumni especially appreciate the blackboard. Now where am I? Suppose one drops a stone from a tower. Appreciate my art. If the stone falls in a straight line, then the tower, and so the earth, must be at rest. For if the earth revolved and the tower moved, and if the observer were moving with the tower, the stone would appear to fall aslant away from the tower. According to Simplicio, quote, "You could not say for sure that the stone described a straight and perpendicular line unless you first assumed the earth to stand still." In order to make plausible the motion of the earth, Salviati has to argue that the seeming simple fall of a stone is compounded of two motions, a lateral motion and a downward motion. And to make this plausible, Salviati raises the ideas of relative motion and impressed force. Let's see. Regarding the relativity of motion, Salviati says, motion is motion and acts as motion, as it has a relation to other things that lack motion. But among the things that participate in motion equally, motion does nothing, and it is as if it were not. For the pieces of cargo stowed on a ship traveling from Venice to Syria, an example natural to the interlocutors, or the various items in one's cabin on that ship, taken relative to one another, the passage of the ship from one place to another is as nothing. Simplicio says this assumption is entirely acceptable to him. He says it's entirely peripatetic. This is doubtful, but I'm going to pass by that question. Accepting the principle of relative motion admits the possibility that the stone and the tower may share the motion of the earth. Simplicio's opposition to this explanation changes its ground. He asserts a body cannot have two natural motions, especially two motions of an entirely different kind, one circular and uniform, rotating around the earth, and another rectilinear and accelerated towards the earth. Again, a seemingly simple experience turns out to be theory-laden. Salviati asserts that when Aristotle claims the perpendicular fall of the stone demonstrates that the tower and the earth were at rest, he's assuming what he's trying to prove. The topic then shifts from a stone dropped from a tower to a stone dropped from the top of a mast of a moving ship. I didn't try to draw that one. There are dialectical reasons for this. Simplicio denies that a body can have two natural motions at once, but he admits that a body could have a motion compounded of two motions of different kinds, one natural and one accidental. If I throw a ball, it has two motions, one accidental and violent, whose cause is external to the ball, my throwing, and one natural, internal, its fall to the earth. Having settled on the example of the ship, Salviati then reverses course and questions the distinction between the natural and the accidental. He maintains that even the accidental motion of the stone being carried along with the ship somehow belongs to the stone, so that the stone dropped from the top of the mast will fall parallel to the mast. Now, the dialogue is set in Venice, and the characters have plenty of experience on boats. On the third day of the dialogue, Simplicio is late to their meeting because his gondola runs aground during low tide. Yet they admit that none of them have performed the experiment. Despite this, Simplicio insists that he is certain what will happen without performing an experiment on the basis of reason alone. And conversely, Salviati claims he can persuade Simplicio that he is wrong, again, without experiment. He says to Simplicio, "You yourself know that it cannot happen otherwise, that is, that the stone will fall parallel to the mast. No matter how you pretend not to know it, I'm so handy at picking people's brains, I shall make you confess this in spite of yourself." So Salviati calls on Simplicio to say what will happen in a series of related imagined scenarios. The scenarios require 1, a plane surface as smooth as a mirror, 2, a perfectly spherical ball of hard material such as bronze, and 3, the absence of any impediments such as air. If the ball is placed on a surface that is inclined, what will happen, Salviati asks. And Simplicio answers, it will spontaneously roll down and be accelerated as long as the surface is extended. And what will occur if the ball with an impressed force is thrust up the inclined plane? And Simplicio responds that it will move up the plane, gradually decreasing in speed until the speed is annihilated, and then the ball will roll down as before. Salviati adds that the acceleration will be greater when the inclination of the plane is greater. The third question, what will occur if the ball is placed on a plane with no slope? As there's no acceleration where there's no inclination, the ball will be still. The fourth question, what would happen if the ball were given an impetus in any direction? There being no inclination, there can be no natural tendency to motion, so there's no cause for acceleration or deceleration. The ball would move and to continue to move as far as the surface extended. At this point, Simplicio has admitted the essential point, that the stone on top of the mast will have an indelibly impressed motion, the same motion as the ship, so that from an observer on the ship, the stone will move laterally with the mast and therefore fall perpendicularly, that is parallel to the mast. So how do we understand Simplicio's assent to this line of questioning? Salviati's claimed, I'm going to make you admit it despite yourself, and Simplicio does so as he predicted. It's sometimes said of the principle of momentum that a body in motion will stay in motion, that it does not belong to experience. It's adopted contrary to experience, under impossible conditions, such as a plane extended without bound and the absence of air. Both interlocutors admit they have never performed the experiment of dropping the stone on the ship. Salviati brings Simplicio to grant the insight merely through questioning. Yet the content of the questions has no meaning independently of common mundane experiences, such as putting something down only to see it roll away, and then pick it up again and put it down again to try and make it still. The questions cause one to imagine familiar experiences and frame them in distinct and simple categories, leading to the affirmation, where there is motion and where there are no conditions, for acceleration or deceleration, and when there's no impediment, motion must be perpetual. As a preface to this exercise, Salviati says, "I do not want you to declare or reply anything other than what you know with certainty." Salviati's challenge to Simplicio, that if he answers the question, he will find he does not agree with himself, is clearly an allusion to Socratic discourse. In a similar passage elsewhere in the dialogue, Simplicio attributes to Salviati, quote, "Plato's opinion that our knowing is a kind of recollection." In this later case of recollection, Salviati says that if Simplicio, in trying to answer the question, cannot find the fitting words, Salviati can teach him the words, but he cannot teach the truths. Those Simplicio must come to himself. To call this learning through questioning, recollection, suggests that the principle of momentum is known prior to all experience, like a common notion in geometry, like as if you had learned it in a prior life. Yet Salviati never gives us a clearly stated axiom about momentum that is presumed to be self-evident. What is meant by recollection is not made explicit. Salviati says, quote, "What I feel about the opinion of Plato regarding recollection, I can signify with words and also with deeds." But he gives no explanation in words. We only see the deeds. We observe the questions that lead Simplicio or Segredo to decide something for themselves. The conversation does not stop here, of course. While Simplicio briefly concedes the argument, his attachment to Aristotelian categories prevails, and he rejects the notion of impressed force, that the motion of the ship may be impressed upon the stone to become a motion of the stone itself. Salviati and Segredo, as an ally, run through multiple familiar examples of impressed force at some length in order to free Simplicio from his theoretical assumptions. What happens if a rider is on a galloping horse drops a ball? Does it fall to the spot directly beneath the location where it was dropped? Or does it continue to move forward during its fall? Simplicio responds, well, if the rider violently throws the ball forward while riding, it will move forward with him. But if there's no violent action, if the ball is merely dropped, it will fall behind the horse, directly to the spot beneath where it was dropped. The categories through which he thinks motion, natural and violent, inherent and accidental, constrain his imagination. Even though Simplicio has said that for Aristotle, experience is more potent than human ingenuity, he himself privileges what Aristotle has written over what can be seen. And in response to this, Salviati contends that books should not teach. They should not teach us, but they should only cause us to notice things, to remember things. Segredo then offers examples from tennis and bowling, where a player puts spin on the ball. That the spin is retained in the ball is clear from the subsequent curvature of the path of the ball. In this case, the motion that is conserved, the spinning, is of a different kind than the forward motion, but the undeniable conservation of one kind of motion, spinning, makes the conservation of the other more thinkable. These various appeals to familiar experiences are not offered as decisive. Salviati calls them a digression. He says that the three of them are not treating the matter methodically, as if they were writing a book. They're following their imagination according to their pleasure. He compares the digression to a story that might be casually inserted into an epic, one that breaks the unity of the epic, perhaps like the stories inserted into the novel Don Quixote. One imagines a wide variety of possibilities, drawing from memory and following the thread of the inquiry in a manner that gradually, without deduction, leads back to thoughts of impressed force and momentum. Recall, however, that with all these pointed inquiries, and imaginative digressions, Salviati never says that he's demonstrated that the earth moves. He does nothing more than establish that if a stone falls parallel to a tower, this particular experience, says nothing about whether the tower moves or not. I have had in mind Husserl's claim that Galileo made a fateful omission, that he applied the ready-made geometry to experience without going back to inquire into the original meaning-giving achievement at the origin of geometry. And Husserl may be correct about this for Galileo's treatment of geometry, but it would not be correct to say that Galileo does not go back to pre-theoretical experience to consider the practical activities out of which the a priori idealities are created. In Husserl's account, once ready-made geometry is projected onto experience, the new concepts in physics and math are piled on top of the geometrical ones, so that everyday experience becomes progressively more buried, increasingly inaccessible. If Galileo accepts the ready-made geometry without question, when it comes to the principles of physics, he rummages around familiar, seemingly obvious experiences in order to explore on what grounds new concepts in physics might be thought. And his patience in rummaging around these experiences seems to exceed the patience of many of his readers. We noted that for Husserl, establishing axioms and making deductions from them conceals the pre-theoretical experiences standing behind them. In this respect, too, the dialogue surprises us. For while Salviati patiently undermines Aristotelian categories, he never establishes new axioms, as becomes clear in one of the climaxes of the conversation. When Simplicio and Salviati are imagining a cannonball dropped from the moon, it's carried to the moon by an angel, and then they drop it. Simplicio goes on the offensive. He presses Salviati to answer a question. Is the lateral motion of the cannonball intrinsic or extrinsic? Salviati refuses to answer. He says, well, by whatever principle the moon is moved in a circle, so also is the cannonball. We do not know the causes by which heavy bodies descend or heavenly bodies move in circles, although we assign the name of gravity to the first cause and the name of intellects to the second. Simplicio, pressing the attack, says that he's not asking for the causes of the motions, but only whether they are internal or external. Thus, for example, although I do not know what entity gravity is, I do know that it's an internal principle, since a body descends spontaneously. And Salviati responds that upon viewing a body descending or a projectile rising, he sees no reason to think that the motion of one is more internal or more natural than the other. The internal-external distinction is not to be seen, to which Simplicio responds, this I shall never admit. The impasse is never overcome. The dispute between the internal and the external is finally a dispute about what it means to be natural. Is natural motion a motion whose cause lies within the moving body, as with the growth of a plant? Or can a natural motion have its cause outside the body, as with throwing a ball, and yet still somehow be within the body? Galileo shows us a dialectic around the fundamental principles of nature, alternating playful imagination and rigorous questioning, but he presents no unequivocal teaching. Okay, part 3. This is the limits of Galileo's mathematical account of natural motions. Our clever non-combatant, Segredo, asks Salviati, but what is the exact line that the stone falling from the tower marks out? From an observer in the same frame of reference, moving laterally together with the stone and the tower, the path of the stone is a perpendicular straight line. If I'm with the tower and I drop a stone, the stone falls perpendicularly to the ground. But Segredo wants to know the line from the Copernican standpoint. Viewing the Earth from a distance, from this point of view, the stone has a compound motion, a lateral uniform motion with the tower, and an accelerated motion downward. Segredo wants to know, what is the precise curve that combines these two motions? Okay. Juniors, having recently read Galileo's 2 New Sciences, will say that the fall of the stone marks out a parabola. If the tower is moving to the east, from BC to DN, the stone should fall from C to B. Yeah. And then, according to the two new sciences, the stone would mark out a parabola that is from C to N. So the stone's falling from C to B, but the tower's moving CB to DN, so the combined motion is C to N. Each step to the right is an equal unit of time, and the body's speed is increasing with the time. And so the spaces, right, that the body covers increase with the squares of the time. And it's the squared relation that makes it a parabola. All the readers of the two new sciences remember this. So much for the two new sciences. In the dialogue, Salviati gives several hints pointing in the direction of this same answer. He says, well, in order to answer Sagredo's question on the precise path, one would have to determine the ratio according to which downward acceleration takes place. And he mentions that his friend Galileo has done work on this question. Salviati even reports to his friends that bodies descend in the squares of the times, but he doesn't do it in this section. He does it elsewhere in the book. So the dialogue gives the mathematical theorem needed to show that the path is a parabola. And yet then Salviati says, well, it would be too great a digression to include these arguments here. And one could see why the parabolic answer may not be satisfying. The parabolic solution abstracts away from the curvature of the Earth, right? The lines of descent, GL, HM, DN, they're all parallel. They don't converge on the center of the Earth. And Sagredo wants to know the true line, the one that captures the fall of a stone from an astronomical perspective. Objective, abstracted from our point of view. And Salviati answers this question. He says the stone descends not in a parabola, but in a circle. Okay. So here is Salviati's diagram. The radius of the Earth is AB. The tower is CB, just as before. The Earth rotates, so the tower moves from BC to DN, again as before. And the stone being dropped from C moves in a curved line, CN. Salviati offers the possibility that the line of descent is a semicircle with a center at E. E bisects AC. So you can see the semicircle, CNA. This possibility, it's attractive because it meets several desired criteria. One, it's a compound motion, right? It compounds the circular motion around the Earth and the rectilinear motion downward towards the center. Two, this motion terminates at the center of the Earth, right? Falling bodies fall to the center of the Earth. So you would expect that the stone dropped from C would eventually strike at A, the center of the Earth, if it could pass through the Earth. Okay. In addition, this path is accelerated, right? Just like with the prior example. And that means that it seems to agree with Galileo's theory. That is, the spaces increase faster than the times. The ratio of CD to DN is greater than the ratio of CH to HM. DN is proportionately greater than HM. The clever Sagredo is thoroughly enchanted by this diagram, and he accepts it without hesitation. Salviati points out several pleasing consequences. Whether the stone remains at west, at the top of the tower, that is, if it moves from C to D, or if it falls from the tower, moving arc C to N, in both cases, the path of the stone is a circle. There are no straight line motions in nature. All motion are curves. Beyond this, Salviati says that the motions of the two arcs, CD and CN, are equable. They're uniform motions, as in Ptolemy. Salviati proves that the arc CD is equal to CN, and thus, in the same time that the top of the tower moves from C to D, the stone moves from C to N. I spent a lot of time, too much time in my life, arguing with myself about whether the proof is correct or not. because the result is so strange. It just doesn't seem possible that CD and CN are the same length. It's like a twisted isosceles triangle. But I'm not going to go through the steps of the proof because there's other things I'd like to do, but we could discuss it during the question period if we wanted. The geometry is counterintuitive, but correct. But the result is quite elegant if one wanted to preserve Ptolemaic or Aristotelian notion of equable circular motion. It's modern terrestrial physics with a Ptolemaic flair. The geometry is correct, but it is not satisfactory as a description of natural acceleration. How rapidly is the stone descending? What are the ratios between the secants of descent and the ordinates of passing time? Right, in the other example, the descending spaces were as the squares of the times, but what's the ratio here? Salviati doesn't state the law of acceleration for this hypothesis. If the line is not a parabola, then the lines of descent can't be the squares of the times. And Salviati warned Sagredo not to get too attached to this idea. Immediately after Galileo wrote the book, like Mersenne and I can't remember, other mathematicians of the time were like, this is completely wrong. So Galileo makes Sagredo pose a question: what is the exact line of descent? It's a question that Galileo himself had not answered, a problem only solved by Newton. The Principia presents a law of acceleration under which one can view earthly motions from a heavenly perspective. On its hypothesis, the resulting curve is a conic section. Oh, okay, sorry, that's of course the Galilean example in which, Salviati's example in which the motion is a circle. And again, this is the parabolic example in which the lines to the descending lines are all parallel to one another. And okay, this is the diagram you use to prove that CD is equal to CN, but again, I'm not going to do that now. And this is the ellipse. Okay. Yeah, the Principia presents a law of acceleration under which one can view earthly motions from a heavenly perspective. Right? A single law of acceleration for the earth and for the heavens. And on that hypothesis, the resulting curve is a conic section, in this case, an ellipse. If the body descends in an ellipse, then the line of descent would not pass through the center of the earth at all. For the center of the earth, the center of attraction, is a focus of the ellipse. It's inside the ellipse. Do bodies fall to the center of the earth or only towards the center of the earth? Elsewhere in Galileo's dialogue, Salviati points to this problem, suggesting that the circular answer he'd given earlier is not correct. Simplicio and Salviati are considering again the example I mentioned before of the angel raising the cannonball to the moon and then dropping it back to earth. How long would it take for the cannonball to strike the earth? They argue about this for a while, and it turns out that Salviati's answer is incorrect. As the two men are disagreeing about the length of the time for descent, Salviati questions whether the cannonball would strike the earth at all, or whether its lateral motion with the moon might not carry it ahead of the point towards which it was dropped, so it misses it altogether. About the correctness or incorrectness of Salviati's proposal of the circle as a line of descent, I'm just going to add one more thing. The tower, maybe we should go back. Yeah, that's good. The tower CB, in this example, the tower is very large, like it must be at least 1,000 miles tall, right? So in reality, of course, the height of the tower is going to be insignificant relative to the radius of the Earth, AB. Okay, probably not 1,000 miles, 500 miles. And if you're looking at the point of tangency at C, where the curve meets C, I mean, one thing Newton proves is there's really no difference between an ellipse and a circle and a parabola when you're very close to C. Ultimately, they're the same. So, okay. Salviati's suggestion that the stone descends in a circle is lovely. It converts accelerated motion towards the Earth into an equable motion around the Earth. But it's also vexing in its impossibility. Why propose this elegant, improbable solution? I can think of two reasons. one dialectical and one mathematical. First, the dialectical. A Copernican, Salviati, is trying to persuade a Ptolemaic thinker, Simplicio, of the truth of the Copernican system. And he's seeking a mathematical mechanics that will unify motions on earth and in heaven, but he doesn't have the mechanics yet. So, near the beginning of the dialogue, he sets out a provisional mechanics, one appropriate for persuading Ptolemaic thinkers. The Ptolemaic philosopher says that by nature, earthly materials travel in straight lines, up and down, whereas heavenly material travels in circles. In order to make the Copernican system plausible to the Ptolemaic, Salviati offers a very closely related but slightly modified principle. Salviati denies, of course, that earthly material and heavenly material are different. He proposes, therefore, that circular motion is natural to all bodies, heavenly and earthly alike, when they are well ordered. And that means when they are where they should be. Straight motion occurs only when the order is disturbed. So, if a stone resting on the ground is well ordered, and it moves naturally in a circle with the earth. But if the stone should be picked up to the top of the tower, it will fall until it rests on the ground again. In order to persuade the Ptolemaic to consider the Copernican system, one needs only, at least provisionally, to get the Ptolemaic thinker to extend the naturalness of circular motions to earthly bodies. And Salviati's suggestion that the stone falling from the tower marks out a circle in equable motion sustains this conceit. It's kind of a mathematical example that looks forward and looks backward at the same time. The second reason Salviati offers this solution is that he, or rather Galileo, lacks the mathematical concepts to compound lateral motion and downward motion continuously and successively. He needs something like the first proposition of Newton's Principia. Saying this doesn't go very far, and I'm not prepared to state with much precision the limits in Galileo's mathematical thinking, still less to speculate about the causes of those limits. Jacob Klein says that, unlike Descartes, Galileo, quote, has not yet at his disposal the powerful instrument of symbolic formula. His physics is conceived as an application of Euclid's and Archimedes' geometry, especially of the Euclidean theory of proportions. In Euclidean geometry, what we draw is an image, a representation of the object being thought. But with symbolic formula, however, the mathematical symbol is a step further away. It doesn't represent objects, but relations of objects, or methods of relating objects. For Klein, at least, Galileo's attachment to Euclidean geometry appears to distinguish him, or perhaps even exclude him, from those who most powerfully advanced the mathematization of nature. Fiat, Descartes, Newton, Leibniz. Galileo's proposed that the book of the universe is written in the language of mathematics, but he lacked the methods to realize the ambition. So I'm going to show quickly one more example of Galileo's attachment to ancient geometry. Here we go. So one might argue against the Copernican system that if the Earth were spinning, bodies would be thrown off the surface by centrifugal force. And Salviati argues against this. He asks Simplicio, if a body is on a spinning circle and the circle ceases its motion, in what direction will the body move? Simplicio takes a little time to ponder this question and comes up with the answer, the tangent, so BD. The secant between the tangent and the circle, DE, represents the impetus of the body away from the Earth, or the distance that natural acceleration downward would have to move the body towards the center to overcome the impetus of the body away from the center, right? So if the body's going to move DE, then the centrifugal force is represented by, if the tangent is BD, that's the direction the body will be thrown. The motion upward is only DE. So the downward tendency, natural acceleration, only has to be equal to DE. One of the features of this is that Galileo is not thinking consistently about the differences between velocity and acceleration. Okay, the tangent and the circle form a horned angle, and the secant, say DE, is very small. And if the circle is expanded to the circumference of the Earth, and if, let's say, the tangent were 1,000 yards, the secant might be an inch. So the impetus away is so small that the downward acceleration keeps the body at rest. Salviati then says something quite bold and false. He asserts that the solution to the problem is simply geometrical. He says no matter how great the velocity with which the circle spins, and no matter how weak the downward tendency, one can always draw a circle large enough in which the secant will be small enough that the centrifugal force represented by the secant is less than the downward acceleration. Okay, that was a mouthful. Basically what he says is, like, assume any ratio of P to Q, like P is your tangential velocity and Q is your downward acceleration. Even if P is really large and Q is really small, you can use a theorem from Euclid, the proportion at the bottom, to draw a circle so that that tangent and that secant will fall on the circle. So it doesn't matter how great the speed is, you can kind of exploit the geometry of the circle to get you a secant small enough that the centrifugal force won't be too great. Okay. The problem is, there are a number of problems with this. One of them is, it assumes you can draw the circle any size you want, but the Earth is a particular size, can't be made bigger. So it so happens the speed of the Earth is not so great. Okay, thanks to Google, I've learned that the speed of the Earth would have to be 17 times faster before we felt centrifugal force, but it's at least mathematically possible. But Salviati's response is, I don't need to think about forces. It's all in the geometry. It really all just goes back to the horned angle in 316 in Euclid, that the horned angle is smaller than any rectilinear angle, so that the secant can always be made as small as you please. Okay, Galileo is exploiting the smallness of the horned angle, the fact that the horned angle, as I said, is smaller than any rectilinear angle. The circle can be drawn to make the secant as small as you please. The problem is not simply geometrical, as a subsequent conversation seems to suggest. Segredo starts to try and frame how to express the tangent and the secant in ratios, and it quickly becomes clear. Ratios as point D moves towards B. And it's clear that Galileo it's in other words, ultimate ratios like you see in Newton. And that Galileo is just not sure how to quantify different kinds of ultimate ratios. The book wants to find a merely geometrical solution to a physical problem, but it also sort of recognizes that the problems are going to require something more than what Euclidean geometry has to offer. Now, there's one more reason I want to show this example. So earlier I said, when Salviati suggests that the body falling from the tower marks out a semicircle, and I said, look, this is a conceit in order to attract the Ptolemaic, he doesn't really think that bodies move in circles uniformly. This pretty much proves the case, right? He's basically saying, like, the table, which is moving circularly around the Earth, is only doing so as a combination of different forces. The tangential velocity as it moves with the Earth, the pulling it off the Earth from the centrifugal force, and the push down towards the Earth. So circles, all the circles are really only products of straight line forces. Okay. Part 4, mathematics and the freedom of philosophizing. I've been picking at lovely faults in Galileo's mathematical natural philosophy. Salviati fails to give the precise line of descent of a falling body. The erroneous solution may be motivated by a dialectical intention, its utility in persuading Ptolemaic philosophers, or it may arise from the limits of Galileo's own mathematical thinking, the optimistic expectation that ready-made geometry will suffice to explain the phenomena. Prior to looking at the mathematical accounts, we also considered the way that Galileo turns to the appearances, ball games, sailing ships, horseback riding. in order to clear the ground of the metaphysical or pre-natural assumptions of the existing natural philosophy, in order to take in the appearances more originally and to divine principles for a new philosophy. He does that in order to take in the appearances more originally and to divine principles for a new philosophy. When we think back on Galileo's assertion that the book of the universe, standing before our eyes, is written in the language of mathematics, one has in mind something like Newton's Principia. Starting from a finite, clear set of axioms, he derives the precise paths of all bodies acting under centripetal forces in earth and in heaven. Comparing the two, it's curious how boldly Galileo asserts the underlying mathematical reality of the appearances when he has articulated with precision and clarity neither the axioms nor the conclusions of the proposed book of nature. I think some of this can be made a bit clearer if we turn to Galileo's letter to Christina of Lorraine. Without going into the historical facts, I'll only note that this was an open letter written for friends and critics, and it was written both prior to the Assayer, where the initial quotation came from, and also prior to the dialogue. The aim of the letter is to dissuade clergy, especially theologians, from making use of passages in Scripture to condemn the Copernican system. Or to put it more broadly, not quite in Galilean terms, the letter aims to establish a measure of freedom for natural philosophy from theological oversight. On one revealing page, Galileo speaks of 3 books. Okay, that's a wall of text. 3 books: the Book of Copernicus, the Holy Scripture, and the Book of Heaven. If, in order to banish this doctrine from the world, it were sufficient to shut the mouth of a single man, that would be very easily done. But things stand otherwise. To carry out such a decision, it would be necessary not only to prohibit the Book of Copernicus and the writings of other authors, but it would be necessary to prohibit the entire science of astronomy, or more, to prohibit men from looking at the heaven in order that they not see Mars and Venus. And to prohibit the whole science, what else would that be but to censure 100 passages of Holy Scripture which teach us that the glory and greatness of the highest God are marvelously discerned in all of his works and divinely read in the open book of heaven. Galileo speaks of heaven as a book, precisely in order to moderate the potential conflict between 2 literal books, the Book of Copernicus and the Bible. By Galileo's account, the Bible and the Book of Heaven have the same author. They come from the same source. Quote, "Sacred Scripture and nature proceed equally from the divine word." Galileo did not originate this trope of the book of nature, far from it, as the allusion to the Gospel of John shows. But he invokes it for a specific purpose. One text, the Bible, he says, not only permits reading and studying the other, the book of heaven, but it actively enjoins it. In order to make space for natural philosophy, Galileo begins with the general question of biblical interpretation. According to traditional theology, and he quotes Augustine at some length and some others too, Tertullian, whom I don't know. According to traditional theology, the Bible is written in a way that accommodates the capacities of regular people. Occasionally, the Bible speaks of the feet or hands of God, which God does not have. It's widely agreed that these passages should not be taken literally, but allegorically. And they should be taken allegorically even if the astute exposition of the words proves to be somewhat remote from their literal meaning. Quote, "It's most holy and most prudent to say that Holy Scripture never lies, but the true sense of it is often recondite and far from the pure sense of the words. Something is recondite when it's been put away, put out of sight. The contrast is between the easily evident surface of the text and an obscure depth. And thus far, Galileo's argument is congruent with general theological practice." Galileo pushes the argument further, however, by extending those occasions in which the Bible must be interpreted allegorically to disputes about natural questions. In such cases, the Bible should yield, quote, to sensed experiences and necessary demonstrations. And again, we see a division between what is apparent to all, sensed experiences, and what is recondite and needs exposition, the necessary demonstrations. In the quotation we started with, we're told to read the Book of Heaven means to look at the sky, to observe Mars and Venus, albeit with a telescope, in order to see how they change in brightness and shape. In this way, when Galileo calls on us to read the Book of Heaven, he enjoins us to turn away from books as such and to look at the sky instead. It's a theme found very frequently in his works, that the philosopher, such as Simplicio in the Dialogue, should turn away from books and look at nature. Or as Salviati said in the Dialogue, in the passage I mentioned earlier, books do not teach us, they remind us. In this sense, to call heaven the Book of Heaven or the Book of the Universe is to call it a sort of anti-book. After sensed experience, necessary demonstration is the second occasion that prompts an allegorical interpretation of the Bible. Whereas the Bible is framed to accommodate the most common understanding, nature has a very different character, in no way accommodating to human capacities. So I think all of us going through the program experience this. Nature is inexorable and immutable, the most observant executor of God's commands. She is the one who does not care at all whether her recondite reasonings or modes of operation may be explained to the capacity of men. For Galileo, the greatness of God is revealed in the splendor of the stars, in the rising and setting, not as mere appearances, as they're evident to animals or fools. The glory of God is revealed in the heavens insofar as they conceal sublime and profound mysteries that have occupied the most acute minds for thousands of years. So we reach the crux of the argument. In the event of a contradiction between the literal sense of the Bible and natural philosophy, how may the theologian be persuaded not to curb the science on the basis of the biblical text, but to interpret the Bible allegorically? Galileo's argument is dialectical. That is, it's framed towards his audience. He asserts that any theologian who has knowledge of other sciences, geometry, astronomy, music, or anatomy, these are the ones he mentions, will agree that that science is to be found less in the Bible than in the books of Archimedes, Ptolemy, Boethius, or Galen. Galileo trusts that the theologian who's scientifically educated, of whom he personally knew and trusted many, will agree with him on this point. And a theologian who is not scientifically educated will defer to the one who is. He earnestly invites theologians to gain competence in the sciences before making judgments. When a reader has come to understand something by necessary demonstration, he cannot be commanded to understand or think something else. We see this right in senior mathematics, weeks of being frustrated by some of the angles in the triangle are not two right angles. It can't be true. Contrary to what we saw, the appeal to the Book of Heaven points us not to nature in this case, but to more books. The Book of Nature's in Archimedes, Ptolemy, Boethius, and Galen, to all the books that contain necessary demonstrations. For the long and accurate observations and extended necessary demonstrations that are needed to reveal nature in its recondite character, these are only possible only through writing, only through books. Of the four disciplines mentioned, 3 are mathematical. And these are the disciplines that most of all have necessary demonstrations. So when Galileo enjoins his readers to turn to the Book of Heaven and attend not only to sensed experiences, but to the inexorable and recondite ways of nature, Galileo is leveraging the respect accorded to mathematics for its necessary character and for its obscurity in order to carve out space where natural philosophy can work autonomously. If the divine word is manifest in 2 books, the Bible and the Book of Heaven, the divine word is aptly interpreted through 2 distinct disciplines, theology and mathematics. And in this way, mathematics becomes independent of and correlative to theology. Back in the dialogue, Salviati says, "What humans know through necessary demonstration is the same in its certainty, that is, in its certainty, as what God knows, although God's way of knowing it is entirely different, and while humans know only a few things, and God's knowledge is infinite." There's one further step in this argument. At first, the argument appears to be that the literal sense of the Bible should not be followed when it's contradicted by an existing necessary demonstration. Yet Galileo seeks to protect Scripture not only from being contradicted by a necessary demonstration in the present, but from being contradicted by any necessary demonstration that might be discovered any time in the future. It'd be prudent, therefore, never to bring Scripture to bear in questions of natural philosophy, for who knows in the future what might be shown through new observations or new demonstrations. As Galileo says, who can put a limit to human genius? What Galileo intends by the Book of Heaven is not understood without taking into account this rhetorical dimension. For Galileo does not mean by the Book of Heaven mathematical natural philosophy as he knew it. It refers to mathematical natural philosophy as an infinite idea, as the gradual accumulation of all future philosophizing towards which humanity strives. Our progress towards the end might be modest relative to the sum total of mysteries presented to us by nature, but the right according to natural philosophy, he argues, should be measured by what it could be, not by what it is. And this step in an argument entails a very large expansion of the freedom of philosophy relative to the Queen of the Sciences. I wasn't going to go into the history, but I'll mention 1615, he writes the letter, and in 1616, he is instructed not to teach Copernican philosophy. So the letter did not persuade the audience it was intended to. We turn to the letter to Christina in order to help think about the gulf between the bold claim made about mathematics in the passage from the Assayer with which the lecture began, and the specific character of Galileo's natural philosophy as seen in the dialogue. For in the dialogue, one finds neither an unequivocal final framing of axioms that could form the basis of a mathematical physics, nor a sufficiently robust mathematics to give an account of motion that could apply equally to earthly and heavenly bodies. In Husserl's characterization, Galileo's application of ready-made geometry to nature launched the development of a physics that claimed to explain the objective reality of all things independent of subjective impressions. And this physics became progressively more abstract and detached from everyday experience, so much that the original meaning of its theorems is lost. All this might be true of physics taken as a whole over the last 4 centuries, but it's not quite true of Galileo at the origin of it all. As Husserl says, Galileo did not go back to the pre-theoretical experience to rethink and reactivate the origins of geometry, but he did attend with all possible care to pre-theoretical experiences in order to ponder the possible principles of a new philosophy. I feel like I should note too, it didn't matter to Husserl if what he said about physics was factually true of Galileo himself. Husserl's interest really was in the evolving historical structures. Galileo's sort of at the linchpin of that. And I think part of why I was interested in this was to think about whether Galileo himself fit Husserl's characterization and whether, in what degree, he belonged to that movement of thought the way Husserl described it. So Galileo made grand assertions about what a mathematical natural philosophy might achieve in order to protect the practices of natural philosophy and the practice of faith. Yet his practice of natural philosophy was, to my mind, more circumspect about appearances, more dialectical in its development, and more open-minded about its limitations than his grand assertions might suggest. Recall that when staking out the boundaries between biblical interpretation and natural philosophy, the Book of Heaven is found in 2 domains, sensed experience and necessary argument. If one appreciates the immense distance between mathematical natural philosophy known to Galileo and the mathematical book of the universe as an infinite task in philosophy, one comes to wonder if the greater part of Galileo's contribution came in the area of careful, rigorous, reflective observations of nature rather than in necessary demonstrations. According to the letter to Christina, the interpretation of the Bible cannot contradict immediate sense experience. But the immediate sense experience is not the ground for establishing the autonomy of mathematical and natural philosophy. Immediate sense experience just doesn't have that kind of reputation that recondite mathematical demonstration does. Despite the greater rhetorical weight given to necessary demonstration, it's always paired by Galileo, always paired with sense experience. And Galileo in the letter notes several observations made by means of the telescope: the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the varying brightness of Mars. He mentions all these as reasons why astronomy should be freed from biblical interpretation. So the consistent pairing of immediate sensed experience with recondite necessary demonstration reminds us of what we see repeated in the dialogue. The autonomy of philosophy as a social activity may depend more on the hidden depth of mathematics and the respect it commands, but productive philosophizing must be no less attentive to and reflective of sensed experience. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.